I went to college for 6 years. Well, it wasn't 6 years. It was 3 years of going to college. Going to classes was another story. 2 years off. This was the 70s. I went to go find myself. I found myself in the garment center of New York City, and I found out something about myself. I didn't want to work in the garment center of New York City. Went back to school at night for a year because they wouldn't let me in otherwise because of all the classes I didn't go to. And then I went back to school during the day, and I finished my degree. And I spent an awful lot of time at the college radio station, where I learned how to be on the radio. And when I got out of school, I went and I got my first job in radio. And I worked really hard those first few months in radio, and almost everybody else I worked with was about my age, was around my age. And after the first few months that they worked there, this was the conversation that happened an awful lot. I learned more in the past month, or I learned more in the past few months, than I learned in all my years in school. Have you heard that? I learned more in the past month or 2 or 3 than I learned in all my years in school. Most of us in here are from tech schools. We have programs, and we're helping people go into certain fields. Isn't that true? Right? It would be a crying shame if they went there and said after 3 months, you know what? I learned more in the last few months than I learned in all my years in school. And I asked myself the question, why would they say that? Why did we say that? And it wasn't only radio, it was all these different industries. And I said, why would they say that? And then I realized that, you see, there's a difference between working at a radio station and learning how to work at a radio station. Right? My father used to run the men's department in a department store. I'll tell you more about my father in a few minutes. But he always used to say to me that these young people out of college would come into work for him. And he would say to them, what do you know about my business? And they would talk about all the theories that their professors taught them. And he'd say, forget the theories. You're working here now. You're working here now. So I went from radio, and I worked in radio for quite a number of years. And then one day, an old radio friend of mine calls me on the phone, and he says, hey, Steve, Gary Axelbank. I said, hi, Gary. He says, listen, I'm the new dean of the broadcasting department at the Center for Media Arts in Manhattan, a tech school. I'd love you to teach for us. Would you like to do that? I said, that would be a kick. Always wanted to teach. Yeah, I'll do that. And so when I sat down with those 18 to 35-year-olds who were in my room, adults and people just out of high school, I constantly kept on my mind, I learned more in the last few months than I learned in all the years in school. And I kept thinking about that, and I never wanted them to walk out of my classroom and say those words. This is our challenge at Gwinnett Tech and at any tech school. How do we get them into their jobs? How do we get them into their careers and not have them say, I learned more in the last 3 months than I learned in all my years in school? How do we do that? By making a personal connection.